Just talking about your beginnings in music, you were quite entrepreneurial in those early days, running your own dances, which I believe became quite popular.
Well, it wasn't so much, I mean, I wouldn't have known what an entrepreneur was at the time. I didn't know anything about running dances. I was a guitar owner as opposed to a guitar player, and I'm not much better now. But it was a matter of a series of accidents, really, because I bought a guitar after I wanted to be a drummer. That's where it started. From probably grade 3 or so, when I went to Bell Primary School, which was also in West Preston. They had a little marching band, just snare drum and bass drum, to bring us in from assembly, and I thought that was pretty terrific. And so I sort of vowed and declared that being a drummer was what I wanted to do. And I think that Christmas, when I was about to go into year 4, my mum and dad gave me a little snare drum for Christmas, or my birthday, because I'm born on Boxing Day, so it was one or the other. And so, because you weren't allowed to be in the band until you were in grade 6, but I had my own drum, so I just fronted up and joined the band. And so that's sort of how it really started. And then I sort of graduated because I wanted to be a drummer. Mum said, "Oh, my nerves, John. I couldn't. No, not drums. No. What about the accordion?" And of course, that went over like a Led Zeppelin. So we settled on the guitar. So when I finally bought a guitar and drove a couple of teachers nuts trying to teach me how to play the damn thing, word got around the neighbourhood that I was a guitar player, which was so far from the truth it wasn't funny. And I had another mate who was learning drums and another one learning bass, and we'd sort of made a little pact that when we were good enough we would start a band, and that got around the neighbourhood too, that all of a sudden we're going to have this rock and roll band. And anyway, so that was sort of just bubbling along, and as my memory serves me, we used to hang around at an espresso bar up nearly to Regent in Preston, and we'd graduated from the Milk Bar in West Preston. We used to hang around till we were about 16, and then a couple of the kids got cars, and so we started to go to the Spro Bar, as we used to call it. And a bloke walked in one day. He said, "Oh, I understand you're starting a band." And at that time, the chap that was going to learn drums had just been called up to national service. I said, big noting a bit. "Oh, well, we were, but he's been called up, and so we're not going to do it now." And he said, "Well, I'm a drummer." And I went, he said like he was a real drummer, like our bloke was, he didn't even have a drum kit. I think he'd had one lesson. And he said, "I'm a drummer." And I said, he said, "What have you got in your band?" I said, "Oh, well, Jeff plays bass, and I've got a guitar." I didn't let on that I didn't know how to get it out of the case yet. I really was useless. And he said, "Oh, well, I know a piano player and a saxophone player and a guitar player." Well, as soon as he said that, my ears picked up, because I thought, thank goodness for that, because I'm not a guitar player. And he said, "What about we have a practice?" So we arranged to practice at his house the following Saturday afternoon. And when we got there, he didn't have a piano. We had a piano player, no piano. And so we played a few songs. I didn't do anything. I just sort of sat there looking. And so I said, "Well, it's not much use just practicing with a piano player and no piano. Where I go to youth club, there's a piano, and it's a little hall in West Preston, not far from here. What about we find out how much it would cost to hire it for a Saturday afternoon?" And they said, "Yeah, why don't you do that?" So I found out that it was going to cost us, there was 7 of us involved by this stage, so So it was going to cost us $2 bob each for the hall for the Saturday afternoon. So we organised to do that, and we had our first rehearsal the following week. And I think I scraped up a few songs that I might be able to sing, because that looked like I was going to be doing. And so we had the first rehearsal. A few kids turned up, friends of ours, and they were dancing while we were playing the same old 8 or 10 songs over and over. And anyway, the next week we did it again, and of course there was even more kids came, because it was about October, early October, and it was sort of too after the footy, but too early to go swimming, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So kids were walking around the streets, and it was quite sunny, and so we ended up with quite a few kids. And anyway, I just piped up and said, I reckon if we ran this advertised it and ran it of a Saturday night, we could probably pull a crowd. This was us with 10 songs, and they turned to me and said, well, why don't you? So that's how I became a dance promoter. I didn't know anything about it, but I did have a mate who was an apprentice printer. So I told him, what I was looking for in a poster. So while the boss was out at lunchtime, he knocked off a bunch of posters, which cost me 15 bob. I still remember all this because it was such an important thing for me. It cost me 15 bob for enough posters to stick around the milk bars and schools and etc. around the neighbourhood. And a couple of weeks later, we ran the first dance, which was, I've still got a poster from that, and I think it was the 21st of November 1959, and it worked well. Mum was selling the tickets. Dad was on the door. A mate of mine, John Carey, was the bouncer, which he didn't have to do anything, but that was his official title. Another mate of mine, Denny Taylor, sold the drinks, and he made more money than anybody. And we charged 4 bob to get in, and it was 100 and maybe 50 kids, 150 kids turned up. And of course it was in a church hall, and in the, Mum was in, my parents were there, so the parents were quite happy to let their kids come to this dance, because the rock and roll dancers of the time didn't have a particularly good reputation, and so a lot of kids wanted to go to these dances, but they weren't allowed. So the age group was fairly young, but probably almost all teenagers, although my youngest sister, who was only about 10 at the time, she was there. Well, she would have been younger than that. But Mum and Dad were there, so she bopped along, and anyway, it worked quite well. We sort of ran out of songs after about half an hour, so we did them again. And run out again and did them again, and nobody cared. And we had the smallest PA. I've still got the amplifier in the shed. It was we had a 7-watt PA and a 5-watt guitar amp, and that was the extent of our electrical equipment. We had an electric guitar player, but he had one of those guitars that had a screw-in lead, so he could only play about 2 feet away from his guitar amp because the lead wasn't long enough. Nothing like today. There was nothing much available. The PA had 2 microphones, both through the same channel, so the saxophone was louder than the vocal, which was probably a blessing, and off we went. And so everybody agreed it was a pretty good exercise. I think the boys we just split what was left after we'd paid for the hall and etc. And I think we made about 30 bob each, and we all thought this is pretty good, because at the time I was probably earning about 4 quid in my day job, and they weren't probably earning any more or less. So it was all go. So we ran another one a month later, and another one a month after that. And it built up, and so that's how it sort of happened. So of course, I couldn't play guitar, so that's how I became a singer, because who really wanted to be a drummer, and that's sort of the way it worked.
I believe that the great radio man Stan Rofe was quite instrumental in getting things off the ground for you too.
Well, Stan came into the picture in September, it would have been September the following year, because the dance in this church hall was getting too big, and we wanted to run it every Saturday, and of course the church hall was used for weddings and all sorts of stuff, so it wasn't always available. So during the year I tried hiring the Preston Town Hall, and that was the same thing. There were lots of things happening there, and so I couldn't get it regularly until the September, and I thought, well, I've got to, if I'm going to do this, I've been promoting dances in other, around the neighbourhood. I did one in Collingwood, and I did one in Coburg, and they were just sort of all, within Cooey of where we lived. We weren't touring as such. Although some bands today, they say they're going on tour and they go across the river. But of course, in those days, we didn't know anything about touring. We didn't know anything about anything, quite frankly. And so anyway, I decided if we were going to run this dance at the town hall on a regular basis, 15 bob for posters is not going to cut it. So Stan, as you mentioned, who became a dear friend of all of us, he was the hottest individual name on Melbourne radio at the time for us kids. And, we all listened to him, and so I thought, well, I'll go and see him, see how much it costs for an ad, some ads on his program. So I was working with my dad in the garage in Swanson Street in those days, in Swanson Street, Carlton. Of course, he was in the Trades Hall building at 3KZ in Lygon Street. So I rang up and made an appointment, and I met him on the steps of the Trades Hall outside the studio. And I came and lobbed around in my overalls, and he came down the steps, and we had a bit of a chat, and I told him what we'd been doing and how Mum was still selling the tickets and Dad was still on the door, and Peter McMurtry was operating the spotlight, or that was the plan. Pete was from grade 3, still a dear friend, and so he was very interested. I think the fact that I was 18 at the time, so I think he was very intrigued by the fact that these young people were, had the, whatever you'll call it, to have a crack at running this dance, and with no adult involvement other than Mum and Dad, of course. And so he said, well, that's wonderful. He said, it's just really good. I said, well, Mr. Rofe, I'd really like to advertise in your program. How much are the ads, please? And he said, well, it's £3 for 30 seconds. Well, I nearly fell over. I was earning about, as I said, about £4 a week in those days. And so, but I had some money in my pocket, so I put my hand in the kick and I pulled out £6 and said, I'll have 2, please, like I was buying bananas or something. And he said, "Oh no!" He said, "Don't worry about that." He said, "I'll get the sales department to send you an invoice, And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Now tell me a bit more about the dance." He said, "What sort of stuff do you do?" And I, went to Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly, etc., etc. And he said, "And who compares you? Who do you have comparing the dance?" I said, "Well, my mate Peter McMurtry is the compere and the spotlight operator, which, when you think about it, is not a bad gig. Talk about keep yourself busy. He was busy as a one-armed piccolo player, because he'd come out and introduce, because we did it like a show. It wasn't like the normal dances. Back in those days, you had the band and you had the singers sort of sitting next on the stage, clapping their hands, or clicking their fingers, but they were on stage all the time. We did a different way. We had the band, and then he'd introduce me, and I'd come out, and we'd do this bit of a mini production, which is very mini. And but he was the compere, so he'd introduce me. Then he'd have to run like buggery up the back of the hall, up onto the balcony, and turn the light on. So it kept him going. And so I said, "Oh yeah, my mate Peter Mack does." I said, "But it gets a bit hard, and if we get a crowd, he'd take him half an hour to get up to the balcony." I said, why? He said, well, how would it be if I compared? And my immediate thought was, how do I afford that? And he must have seen it, the look in my eye of horror. He said, I wouldn't want any money for it. He said, I think it'd be terrific for me. He said, for the kids to get to know me and me to get to know them. He said, what do you think? And I said, oh, that'd be fantastic. He said, good, okay, well, so I told him when the date was and et cetera, et cetera. And he said, right, well, I'll be there. And so I went and saw my mate again and got some more posters done, and this time with featuring Stan the Man from 3KZ on the poster, and the mates went around and stuck them up here, there and everywhere. 7:30 on the Saturday night, there was Stan, and during the week, I might add, he had my 2 ads. I couldn't tell you how many ads I got. He just kept on mentioning it every time he'd say, all right, that sounds like the sort of song that, you play Chuck Berry or something. Sounds like the sort of song Johnny Chessman, the Chessman might do out at Preston Town Hall on Saturday night, should get along there. It sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun. I'll be there, of course, and, and off he'd go. And he did this right through the week or 2 weeks before the dance, and poor old mum was one of her feet. All of a sudden, all these hundreds of kids turned up, and Stan was there at 7:30, in his bone cardigan and a shirt and like a polo neck shirt, would take his cardigan off and he'd be out introducing me and introducing the band, and then he'd get down and dance with the kids, and it was just amazing. And of course then the next week he'd talk about it again, and he said to me, would you like to come in and we'll do an interview? So I'd go in there and I'd be on air for an hour and a half with him, and we'd be talking about, what about this one, John? Do you think you might learn this for next Saturday night at the town hall, and all this sort of stuff? And it just went berserk, and it was all accidental because it was just right time, right place, and we were very, very green. As I said, we probably learned a few more songs, and I wasn't the only singer. There was 2 or 3 very good singers in the band that all contributed to the night. So we did it like a little show, and it was for the time quite unique.
Now, just jumping forward a few years, there is footage around of you on stage at Festival Hall on the Beatles show, and no doubt you've seen it. You're looking pretty confident and comfortable on stage. Were you always a confident stage performer?
I've never been comfortable, even to this day, on stage. Well, that's not right. Before I go on stage, I would be a mess. Back in those days, it wasn't uncommon for me to drive to the dances, just before the Beatles tour, with a bucket between my knees, and because I would throw up while I was driving, which was a lot of fun. But I used to get so nervous about performing. I've always suffered from anxiety, and this would come out. But generally, once I hit the stage, that would disappear as soon as I got out there. But before I got out there, I was a mess, and various, I won't bore you with it all now, but various times. But one particular one I remember was the Saturday night before the Beatles tour. I was guest artist at the Mentone Town Hall rock and roll dance, and I'd been to the doctors during the week, and I said, look, I'm going away for 3 weeks with the Beatles. We're doing 2 shows a night. I said, I can't eat before a show. I can't eat when I'm flying. I said, and we're going to be fed between shows at the Beatles thing. And I said, I'm going to be useless. Can you give me something to just settle me down a little bit? And so the doctor gave me these tiny, tiny tablets. I don't know what they were. He said, just take one of these about half an hour before you perform, and it'll calm you down. So I'd never taken anything like this before, and of quite frankly, I don't think I've ever taken one since because it was amazing. So I take this little tablet and went out to do my show at the Mentone Town Hall, and I just kept, it was like I was doing it in slow motion. And I was yawning, I go to say something, you go, which is not what you want from a rock and roll singer on stage, I was leaning against the wall, I remember a beautiful line once that Dean Martin dropped. He said, I forget who he was talking about, he said, but he makes spaghetti look tense. Well, I was like that. I was just useless. And so I thought, did the show. I don't remember much about it. As in, it wouldn't have been too exciting, I can imagine that much. But so I thought, I can't do this. I can't go out on stage with the Beatles and be yawning and falling over. Well, I wasn't falling over, but I was just far too relaxed. And so I decided I wasn't going to take them, and I never did. But in Adelaide, before the first show, I went out behind the hall, at Theberton Town Hall, or no, it wasn't Theberton. Anyway, wherever it was, at the Centennial Hall in the I think it's in the showgrounds in Adelaide, and went out the back and threw up and came back in, and anyway, I did the first show, and I don't know if you ever saw what I was doing on that show, but once again, my mate Peter Mack, he and I worked out that a lighting thing for the old song Fever. We wanted I thought if I can do something that's a little different, because in those days stage lighting wasn't being used by bands, or the Beatles had no production, they just used whatever the hall could offer, same with PA or anything like that.
Yeah.
And this was generally the case. All the, even the biggest acts had, they just used what was provided. And so I took a little spotlight that Mac had given me and some ultraviolet strips for the drummer, the bass player, and the keyboard player who was playing claves. And I gave the drummer some Day-Glow painted drumsticks, and those three guys wore white gloves, and we got them to black out the hall, turn on the purple light, and so the theory was the white gloves would shine in the dark, the drumsticks would shine in the dark, and then the little spotlight that I had was placed in front of me on the stage with a red gel, and that shone on my face. So all you saw on stage supposedly was my red face and three sets of hands and a couple of drumsticks, and it was very effective, except the Phantoms decided to wear these sort of tinsely looking suits, so it kind of destroyed it a little bit. But even so, it was still pretty effective. And so after the first show, I got out there, and because everybody was going well in the show. I mean, it wasn't like, the Beatles, of course, were amazingly well received, but everybody was. Even the Lolly Boys were getting a round of applause. So it was it was that sort of atmosphere. And so I came off stage and the first show, and then John Lennon came up to me. He said, you've got to imagine, he did swear when he said this, but I'm not going to.
Yeah.
But he said to me, where'd you get that idea from? I said, what? The lights and the gloves. And I said, oh, well, I said, I think the Black and White Minstrels, I think, used to do something like that. Oh, he said, that was great. That was great. Well, I was eating between shows. I was eating in the plane. I never threw up in the plane. Everything. It was just all of a sudden this huge boost of confidence.
Yeah.
And the show, the little bit that I did 4 songs. but the response to it was excellent. We had two major muck-ups really. I think it was in Wellington in New Zealand when the red light, or when my spotlight came on, the globe blew. So all you saw on stage were these gloves and me wandering up and down the stage that nobody could see. So that probably didn't have the same effect there. And the other one was in Melbourne when, between shows, of course, they'd moved the light because it was right down the front. And so Mel Evans, the Beatles road manager, would grab that and push it back behind, behind them, the Beatles. And in the course of, I don't remember which show, we did 6 in Melbourne. I don't remember which show it was, but in between one or the other, the light got knocked, so it wasn't really aimed at, when I put it back in its spot, because I used to do that myself and used to carve my own lights. I mean, as you did a road manager or anything. And, of course, came out to the show, rhubarb, get the intro of Fever Out of the Road, and when the spotlight came on, it shone right on my fly. So that caused me to sing that song on my knees. But other than that, it went fairly well, and of course it will forever be in my memory.
Sure. Was there anyone particular of the Beatles that you became particularly friendly with on the tour?
I wouldn't. I don't know. It was very hard to spend any time with them because there was so many people with them. They had this entourage of press and people that were just hanging around, and. But I suppose I did have a long conversation with George Harrison in Melbourne because, once again, it's at Festival Hall in Melbourne. I don't know if you've ever been there, but backstage in those days, it may be, I hope, improved by now, but in those days, Festival Hall was a boxing stadium, so you didn't have dressing rooms as such. You had these little sort of cubicles, and so backstage it was pretty hard to get away from anybody. And George and I had a long conversation. We were both about the same age, and we were talking about cars and songs and guitars and stuff that a couple of young blokes would talk about. And big difference was George had just sold his Prefect and bought an E-Type Jaguar, whereas I was still driving a 58 Holden. Bit different there. But then probably John Lennon, he sought me out a few times. He bought Paul McCartney. I used to get these boots made in those days. There was a chap in West Preston, Ronald Thomas Taylors, who used to make all my outfits for me, and they were marvellous. And there was a chap down in Collingwood who used to make my boots. And I used to have these really, really pointy toed. You can buy them these days, but back in those days you couldn't buy anything like this. And I remember John bringing, I think it was Paul, and, come and see these boots. You've got to see, because they'd graduated to chisel toes by this stage. We were still with pointy toed shoes, and. But he'd never seen anything as pointy, so that was one little incident. And the other one, the other times he invited me, he asked me why I never came to their parties, and I said, I don't feel right. Seems like everybody's sponging off you, sort of thing. And he said, yeah, well, that's about to stop. And so I don't know what was the matter. I think he was getting a bit cheesed off with the fact that all these people were drinking their grog and eating their food and not putting their hand in their pocket. But he did. So I suppose of all of them, we had the most to do with one another. Paul, was introduced to Paul in Adelaide. I never did meet Ringo. We sort of waved in the corridors because he came and joined the show many years later, a couple of days after we started, and consequently the introductions were done in Adelaide, so all I got out of Ringo was, hello, as he'd walk past you about to go on stage. So I didn't exchange any more than that with him. or Paul, because Paul was always more the PR guy, so he was networking pretty successfully. John, I think, was pretty good at that too, but he would, as I explained, he seemed to get a bit cheesed off with some of the attitudes, or the attitude of some of the people backstage, and even George, one day we were in New Zealand, and we were about to go on stage, and I was just standing next to him, and the introduction was being done, and he's trying to tune his guitar, because in those days they didn't have electronic tuners, so he's got I think it was a Gibson at the time, and he's, just an electric Gibson, so he's got his ear up against the body and, plucking, and there's this journalist next to him, and he's yabbity, and George is trying to tune his guitar, and once again, I can't swear, but he said, "Will you off?" Trying to tune my guitar, and the guy goes, "Oh," because he was such a gentle person. I think it really shocked him that he, this came out of him. But I can understand. He's about to go out and do a performance, and this whacker's, bending his ear. You can see what he was trying to do, and he just wouldn't shut up. So he did after that.
Now, you landed your own TV show after that tour. How did you adapt to the medium of television? Was that a smooth transition for you?
Well, I'd actually had some experience with television as a host the year before. Keith McGowan, you remember, from 3AW.
Yep.
And, well, Keith's first... all these stories are so long. You on air for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week or something. Anyway, Keith's first job in radio was as a panel operator at 3UZ. And then he got his first job as a disc jockey, an announcer, at 3TR in Sale, in about 1960, I think, and I could well be wrong there. Anyway, he started there, and it might have been 59, it was somewhere around there anyway. And I was down there doing a show at your lawn one night, and we had Keith McGowan comparing from 3TR, and Barry Ferber, whose name you may remember from 3DB years later. He was on not 3GL, what's it, at Warragul, 3UL. And anyway, so they were co-compares of the night. And during the course of the night, I was having a chat to Keith, because he was around my age, and he was complaining how nobody ever came to Sale, so he never ever got a chance to practice his interviewing. And I said, "Oh, well, I'll come down, you can interview me." He said, "Oh, that'd be terrific." So I used to drive down from Preston, down to Sale, do a half hour, an hour on the air with Keith, and then turn around and drive home again. And I did that several times. And anyway, so that was we formed a very close friendship. And then he rang me up one day. He said, "Look, I've got a chance to do a television show on the local station at Traralgon." He said, "They want to hear me interview somebody. What do you think?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll come down." So I went down, and he interviewed me for this show, and which he was given, and which was lovely. And it was called Teen Time on 10, because Channel 10 in those days, well, in Traralgon, in Gippsland, there was Channel 10. And so we did the interview, and he got the show. And then a few months later, I got another phone call. He said, "Look, I've got a really good job offered to me at, I think it was 70X or 7LA in Launceston." He said, "and I'm going to take it." He said, "And I've suggested you to be the host of Teen Time on 10. I went, "Oh, okay." So I got my first shot because of Keith McGowan. He went to Launceston and continued in radio, for 50 odd years, and I got my first shot as host of Teen Time on 10, which was a half-hour Saturday afternoon sort of music show. We didn't have film clips, of course, in those days. We didn't have videotape in those days. It was all done live, and some of the some funny stories. But yeah, you've only got me on air for a week, so I better shut up.
You also did radio for many years on 3UZ. How did you manage balancing that work with your music career at the same time?
Well, it's sort of my musical career, or music. By this stage, of course, I was married, and we had our first daughter, and Liz and I. It was poor planning on my part. When I started, I thought I've always been one to set myself goals, things to work towards, and so the ultimate goal for me at that time was to get a national television show. And I thought that's pretty well impossible, but I might as well aim for the stars, And so that was what happened. And of course, when I eventually got Teen Scene on the ABC, which was the next step for television for me, I got we did the two series, 64, 65, and I'd never planned beyond that because I never thought I'd achieve it. And so all of a sudden, when that finished, I was, sitting there with nothing to do. We had the band, but I mean, there was no, agents and things in those days. Our manager was a very good publicist, but she really wasn't a manager in that respect, and she didn't know. So we virtually had nothing to do. So I started to, and by this stage, the band were feeling a bit unhappy about things, which was fair enough. So we decided to fold Johnny Chester and the Chessmen, and the guys, we still great mates, but that's how that happened. They all had day jobs anyway, and I didn't have a day job because I'd, of course, given up the garage with Dad many years before. So once again, without boring you with the interim, but when I joined 3UZ, there wasn't a lot to give up. There were several things I was doing. Over the summer, I used to run a dance at Ocean Grove for the Recreation Hall Committee, but I'd do an occasional gig with, in the latter part of the 60s. Where I met Jigsaw. We got together in 1968 and went to Vietnam to perform for the troops over there. And so then when we came back, we thought this feels pretty good. So we started to work together. But it really was pretty restricting because I was working from midnight till dawn for those 2.5 years. And other than, as I said, the summertime, which I had an agreement with my mum and dad that we bought our first house from my mum and dad, and I said, well, I'm not going to have any money to give you, but I'm running this dance in summertime, so I'll give you whatever I get out of that. So over the 7 years I ran the dance, I paid for the house, and so that was about the only regular performing that I did. And so that was kind of the way it was. I was on radio and loved every minute of it, and then ended up staying on. I was on salary still at 3UZ for almost 10 years, but I was off air after about 2.5.
When you teamed up with Jigsaw, was it always the plan that they would back you, but they would still have their own recording career running separately as well?
Well, initially it was, we sort of, we got together, as I said, for Vietnam. We'd all been mates before, the band. They were all a bit younger, a couple of years younger than me, so, and they'd come up through a different era, if you can call it that. And so when we got together, we were just, working in the pubs and things like that. And then I got my second recording contract with Ron Tudor when he formed Fable Records, and so I did a couple of tracks with Tude, with the full orchestra, all that sort of stuff. but continued working with Jigsaw in the pubs. And so I said to, I forget which was the first one we did together, but I said to Jude, I'd like Jigsaw to back me on things. We can work it up, work the songs up, and he said, yeah, okay. Because Ron Tudor, who, once again, very dear friend and so important to my life, Jude trusted you. If you're doing the job, it was just a wonderful way to work. And so I said, yeah, I think they can, we can do some good stuff together, which we did. And then so we did 2 or 3 singles, and might have been more. And then I said to Jude, I'd like Jigsaw to record too, if you got anything. And he's obviously been thinking about it too. So she said, yeah, I've got this song here. And so he gave him this song called To Love Means to Be Free, which they did and I produced. And then, of course, he came up with Yellow River, and same thing, they played, I produced, and et cetera, et cetera. So it was always on stage. It was, they weren't the backing band, if you know what I mean, because they all sang, and they were all very good singers.
Yeah.
All good lead singers. And so we used to do it more like a show band thing, where I'd introduce and now Dennis has got such and such to do for you, whatever, and we would go through a night, and we do 4 or 5 hour gigs. We do a lot of country cabaret nights where we'd do a barn dance and all that stuff. We were quite versatile for what we were doing. We weren't living the pop star life. We were out there to entertain people, and they were terrific like that, because they were all silly as I was, and we were all young, and we had some wonderful times together. And fortunately, I was telling somebody the other day, I think in 1972 on the 3XY chart, we went for the whole year without at least, there wasn't 1 week when we didn't have at least one song in the chart, and for the whole of 72. So, that set us up. But of course, they had, a couple of the guys in the band had day jobs too. So we were restricted in what we could do because of that. I was at 3UZ, but my job there was really, I wasn't tied to the building. In fact, I tried to resign on a couple of occasions, and Mr. Bennett, Lewis Bennett, no, we can't have that, John. Look, what about, and he came up with a way of me able to do what I had to do and still stay there. And so I had a lovely arrangement there, and which just added to my respect for for 3UZ as a radio station, and for the people that worked there, Lewis Bennett, John McMahon, Fred Tolley, and the announcing staff, of course, was phenomenal. And the best thing I've ever done professionally was get the chance to work at 3UZ.
You had a string of hits in that era, and it must be something you look back on in great pride, because you were bringing Australian country music into the mainstream top 40, which was a bit of a rarity.
Well, I think Slim had done it a couple of times, and then there'd been several others, they've bobbed up from time to time. But I looked at what was being done in America and could never really work out how they were doing what they were doing, except it seemed to me the one thing that Australian music lacked from a radio point of view, and this is where the experience at 3UZ was invaluable, was that they didn't have a lot of bottom end. The drummers always had a really piddly, there was sort of a tapping away in the background, and I thought, if we're going to get something happening, they've got to be stronger than that. And so, not rock and roll, I didn't want, but I guess my rock and roll background had a bit to do with it, but it needed to have a bit more kick drum, a bit more bass, and a bit more drive to it, without being necessarily fast, but more that sort of thing, so that when it came on the radio, that the levels didn't drop away, if you know what I'm getting at. And and that, I think, there again, the time at 3UZ helped me enormously there, whereas had I not done that you worked that time at 3UZ, because I went from on air to programming and production work and promotional work. I'd learned to drive a double-decker bus. I mean, how many things, how many good things can happen to a bloke, and it was just a marvellous time working with some wonderful people.
Talk about your songwriting. Has your method, the procedure you go through in writing a song, has that changed much through the years, or it's still the same way?
Well, I don't really have a procedure. I get an idea and work on it, and sometimes that can happen in, like, The World's Greatest Mum took me 10 minutes to write. Rebecca was about 7 years in between when I started it and when I finished it, and it wasn't like I was sitting down every day trying to make it work. It was just some things come to you in a flash, other things take quite a while, and I'm still the same. I'm in the midst of putting a new single together at the minute, and that's been sitting there for a few years. From when I wrote the song and even the writing of it, you still tweak them. You sort of, you get them. You might sit down. I've got I don't call it a studio, but I've got a microphone and a little recording program in my computer, a little mixer, etc. And I'll get there with my guitar. I've learned, I know about 4 chords now. So 4 chords and a capo, that's me. And I'll sing it a few times and think, and then go back to it and maybe change. And even when you're recording, I did the vocal on this new one the other day, and I thought it's not quite sitting right. So there was just a little adjustment. There's things that happen, and over the years there's been songs I've released and thought, oh, why did I say that? Why couldn't I have said this? That would have been much better than that. So, it's an endless sort of process, but I don't have any set way of doing it. Some people sit down every day and write. I don't. I love to write. I've written a couple of plays, and I've got a story on the way on the go at the moment, which is, I hesitate to call it a novel because I won't call it that until I finish it, and I doubt I'll ever do that. But a lot of bits and poetry and stuff like that. Just to enjoy writing, to get the word down and then look at it afterwards and think, there's got to be a better way. I didn't mind that. Or now and again you'll come up with a line and think, that's a good line. And then you build a song around it, which I've done, many, many times. Or just had a title and then work from there. Or, sometimes the opening line on this new song, which is called The Loneliness of the Long Distance Lover, and it's I won't spoil it by telling you all about it, but it's the opening line is, he saved her message on his mobile phone so that late at night, when all alone, he still could hear the sweet sound of her voice. And so, he's a truck driver, but he does long haul, so he's away for a long while. And, he's got a family, and so it was setting it up from that first line. And my theory, I'll be proven right or wrong when people hear it, is that people go, oh, I wonder what's going on there. To sort of try and get people's interest. Other times you start on the chorus, like The World's Greatest Mum, bang, they've got them. This one's more a story song. It actually does 2 verses before it gets to the actual chorus about the loneliness of the long distance lover, and it's no process, just whatever works and keep working on it.
Yeah. What about picking songs to cover? You've had a bit of success with that over the years too. Songs like Midnight Bus, Shame and Scandal. Is there a criteria you used in choosing the right songs to cover, the ones that suited you?
No, I don't. No, I don't think there's any. Once again, you hear a song and think, whoa, gee, why didn't I write that? And sometimes I've got a Bill Anderson song. Do you know Bill Anderson, the country singer who wrote that song called Still, and another one called Tips of My Fingers, which were country classics, and he's written lots of songs. And I've got one of his that I found when I was at 3UZ, so I've had it for 40 odd years, and I just, when I played it to people, they say, "When did you write that?" And I said, "I didn't write that." They go, "God, it sounds just like you." It's a style of song. It's like when I did Lonely Women Make Good Lovers, and people thought I wrote that. And when I did Gwen, a lot of people thought I wrote that. Because you do My Kind of Woman, which I did write, and they're kind of in the same kind of vein, if you know what I mean. And, but I don't, Midnight Bus. When I did that, I'd had a reason. I think probably my biggest hit in my first year recording was '61, and the third single I did that year was "Shaken All Over," and anyway, it was top 5 or something like that on some of the charts, and anyway, I needed to get something, because in those days I wasn't writing, and I needed something to follow it up. And I was out at the Ringwood Town Hall one night watching a mate of mine's band. I think they were called the Tornadoes, I think. And their guest that night was Betty McQuaid. And Betty's out there doing what Betty did so well and singing her songs, and she dropped Midnight Bus in, and I went, "Oh, God, that's it. I've got to do that." So she hadn't recorded it at this stage. She didn't have a record deal. So I was all excited, and I went in to see Stan, because Stan always had a bit of a say in what we were recording in those days, and in many cases suggested songs, particularly in those days. And anyway, I was going in to see him to see if he had a record of Midnight Bus, because I'd never heard it before. And I was sitting in the foyer outside the studio at 3KZ, and Betty came up the stairs, excited beyond belief. I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "I've just got a record deal. I'm going to record for AXA." "Oh, wonderful. What are you going to do?" She said, "I'm going to do Midnight Bus." So that was the end of that for me. So I waited 11 years, and then I did it. So it was sort of, it was a favourite for a long time. And so, once again, no process. You sort of 6 songs away, and I have recorded the Bill Anderson song. I just haven't finished it yet. It's pretty well finished. It needs to be mixed and mastered. But there's many others that are that I love and will maybe get around to recording. My recording career now, if you can call it that, is very much my hobby. I haven't performed for about 10 years live, and my life these days, I turned 75 last Boxing Day, so and I've had an amazing run. So I figure, well, there's plenty of other people out there to entertain the folks, but I still love writing and recording, so I'll continue to do that till they say, "Sorry, son, but what are you going to do next? What about going back to your day job?" And there's not a chance of that happening. In fact, funny little story, for the first 30 years of my life in the music business, I was asked constantly, from people all over Australia. You travel like a... I remember clearly being asked this in Mount Isa one night, where we finished the show. We'd had a full house at the Mount Isa City Hall, which is about 1,100 seats, and but we always went out after the show, and we this was in the mid '80s, and always go out and meet the people afterwards, and pose for photos and sign autographs and just chat. and it was lovely. And this chap came up to me, he said, what do you do for a real job? And I said, I'm a butcher. He said, oh, really? You know, but he was very nice. I thought he'd get that I was being silly, but no, he took it square. You know, he said, really? I said, oh yeah. And I thought, oh, hang on, how do I get out? I said, yeah, it's a bit annoying because he didn't know where I lived. You know, I could be a butcher. I said, I'm going to have to leave soon because we opened the shop at, I've got to get up at 4. And he's going, yeah, well, that's right. You know, it's one of those jobs, isn't it? You know, we had a bit of a chat about me being a butcher. And, but that's that question, you know, what do you do for a real job? I couldn't, if I had $1 for it, I could get a new car if every time I'd been asked it. And anyway, when Liz and I decided to come off the road in 1989, and I'd been offered a 2-year contract with Radio Australia, so I decided, we've been thinking about the situation with the band and Hotspur at that stage was that, the guys were coming and going and things weren't as good as, they were working, the shows were working, but it wasn't as enjoyable. And, there was a bit of niggling going on and stuff, and I thought I've had enough of this. So I decided to take this contract with Radio Australia, and that was for 2 years. And Liz and I had talked for years about something we could do together, because as you can imagine, that long-distance love I was talking about, there's a lot of it about me in a lot of ways, because we were, you're working at something you love, but it's keeping you away from things that you love more, which is your family. And, people... I'm sure people think about it, but why would they be bothered? They've got their own problems. And so we talked about doing something together, talked maybe getting a motel or whatever. Anyway, we ended up buying a little, what was to be called a general store in Sorrento, because we had a holiday house down there, and we knew this little shop because it was kind of our local store. And so... after 2 years at Radio Australia, I said to Liz, I think, it turned out, during that last year, it turned out that the shop was for sale, so we bought it, and at the end of 1990, 91, we became shopkeepers. But of course, it was during now that recession we had to have, and I remember a bloke coming up to me at the in the shop, never knew him before, and he said, "You decided to buy a shop?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Lucky you've got your singing to fall back on." And I thought, isn't that wonderful to hear? 30 years it take me to convince people that that's what I do for a living. That's my real job, And that was, that. So, yeah, it is funny, but it was part of the thing, because nobody, when I started, considered that you could have a career unless you would, become a musical. A musical comedy star. But if you're going to stay in Australia in those days, and there was very few people who could say they were, you might get on IMT like Bill McCormick and people like that. But even Bill was, had a reception rooms, and most of the people that were involved in the music business as such either had a day job as such, or they had, there was Johnny O'Keefe was pretty much a full-time performer when I started. Cole Joy, I'm not sure about. Cole and I are still great mates, but I don't know whether he was working like as a day job when he first started. When he was first recording and stuff, because by the time I was recording, I'd given up the garage, and that was my real job. But but I always had the brakes to fall back on, if anybody asked me. But of course that never happened.
And just before I let you go, John, for people trying to break into a career in music today, it's a much different arena to when you started. But can you think of any advice from lessons that you learned in your day that would still apply to people starting out now?
Well, there's lots of things. It depends, where, who, how. There's so much ability around today. I mean, as I explained, I owned a guitar. That was it. These days, the standard of musicianship, the vocal ability of people, the understanding of the music business. We didn't have any of that. I had the opportunity some years ago of working with James Broughton, who'd been Ricky Nelson's guitar player back in the 60s, and then went on to play with Elvis and Roy Orbison and John Denver and Emmylou Harris and you name it. And he came out to Australia with Elvis Costello, and I got a chance to have him record a song with me. And we were chatting after the session, and I said to him, you were my first guitar hero, because until you came along, the guitar players that we saw were generally in the big bands, strumming away in the background, generally pushed up, in the dark. So you really couldn't learn anything, whereas James was 16 or 17 in that show, and he was just an amazing guitar player. And, we had nobody to look at and to learn from, whereas today kids, they can go online and I wonder how that solo is played. And you can Google guitar solo from whatever the song is, and a guy will play it for you. And you can slow it down, and there's just so much opportunity. So I would say, it's kind of hard to answer that question because. But probably the best advice that was given to me over all those years was be yourself. John McMahon at 3UZ, he was a mighty bloke, and he was the program director, and he was really the only one that wanted me at UZ, I think, initially in the executive side of things. I don't think anybody else was too keen, but John saw something in me that nobody else could see. I certainly couldn't see it, but he could. And he said he used to get me in, I was up midnight to dawn, so I'd get home at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'd go home and I'd sleep generally till, say, 2 o'clock, have breakfast and sleep till 2 o'clock or something like that. But if, John, when in the first initial stages, I'd get a phone call at 9 o'clock, and it'd be Mr. McMahon, as I called him then, be his secretary. Could you ask John, me, to come in? Mr. McMahon would like to talk to him. Could he be here at 10 o'clock? So I'd be half asleep, more than half asleep. So I'd stagger in there, and you knew you were in trouble when he closed the door when you walked in. And he closed the door a lot with me. And he'd put the tape on of the program I'd done the night before. And he'd say, and he used to get really angry. He wasn't very tall, John. John McMahon, wonderful. He was a wonderful Irish tenor in his youth, and he still could sing, even in the he was in his 40s by this stage, I would think, maybe his 50s, and still used to do IMT and things like that. So he knew that side of it as well, and maybe that was what he saw in me. I don't know, but he would get me by the scruff of the neck, and he'd say, "Who the bloody hell were you trying to be last night? Why? What are you?" And he'd rip into me. "Yeah, we've already got a Stan Rover, and we've already got a Don Rainsford, and we've already got a rattle." He said, "Be yourself. We've only got one of you. Be yourself." And so that's the way. And isn't that great advice?
Yeah.
Because you tend to. I hear kids on Idol and all these other programs, and it seems like they've all been listening to the same there was a stage there when I think Idol first started. I think they've all been listening to Stevie Wonder. Like, it was just so much influenced by, and I if you could get my DNA, if there's such a thing as a musical DNA, you would find little smatterings of a million different people. You'll learn from them all, but out of that becomes you. You've got to develop you. It's no use being, the second best anybody else. Be the best you, and
exactly.
Whatever that means. And it's hard when you especially when you start off and you're doing, pubs and things like that, or dances as we did. The kids want to hear things they know, and they want to hear it as close to the record as they can. And these days, even more. Those days, most of the records we had, they'd been to parties, they were covered in dry beer or whatever, and so to sound like the record wasn't that hard. All you had to do was soak yourself in beer. But if you know what I mean, I'm just saying that the sound, through the equipment, like a 7-watt PA doesn't cut it. Your watch has probably got more wattage than that, and certainly your phone, and so but you still try to do what the people want, and you still got to do that even when you're being yourself. But if you can put your own little twist on it to make it yours, I know with with girl singers, I'll say, when I've been asked advice on things like that, I say, well, if you're going to do songs by other people, do bloke songs. Don't do girl songs, and you got to do some, but do bloke songs. Get songs, like I've recorded Delta Dawn, for instance, which was a hit for a lady, and I've recorded Helen Reddy, and I recorded If You Love Me Let Me Know, and so many things like that, because Blanket on the Ground, people don't expect to hear a bloke sing it. When the bloke sings it, they go, oh, they don't compare you, and that's one of the problems you have with when you start doing other people's songs. I'd never do Roy Orbison's songs because I just couldn't do them well enough, and that was simply that. And so I think I've just bored you there with all that stuff because I don't think I actually told you anything.
No, be yourself. It's great advice for any job, really.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah.
Hey, John, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. I know you're busy getting ready to go away tomorrow, so I do appreciate it.
Oh, you're more than welcome, and thank you for asking me. And I don't know how much of that you can use, but there's plenty to choose from.
No, some wonderful stories, and congratulations on a mighty career.
Thank you very much, John, and I hope we'll meet in person one day.
That'd be great.
Good on you.
All the best.
Thanks, mate. Bye.
Bye.